He once bathed in rosewater and wore the king's perfumes. Now flies drink from the wounds that split across his thighs like torn parchment, the last verses of a forgotten psalm. His body, naked, bloodied, and mutilated, swings gently in the cold November wind, not like a man but like a warning. The gallows creak with each sway, wood groaning beneath the weight of political desire turned to rot. The crowd gathered in Hereford is not jubilant. They are not jeering, they do not spit. They only watch, eyes narrowed, throats tight, a silence more damning than any scream. For before them dangles not a traitor, not a foreign enemy, not a thief or heretic. This was the king's favorite. He once walked through the palace halls with a gaze that needed no permission, sat at the monarch's side as equals in laughter, in whispers, in flesh. He was not just beloved, he was needed. And yet here he hangs, as if he were a plague to be purged, his mutilation laid bare so that the king's sins could be forgotten through spectacle, the testicles removed, the name erased. But memory does not obey the executioner's blade. Who was he? A man of low birth, perhaps, but of high charm, a soul that rose too far, too fast, on the wings of forbidden affection. The court once whispered of their nights together, of the way the king's hand lingered too long, of the gifts, the titles, the unchecked laughter in the throne room. But those same whispers turned venomous, because power, when touched by something tender, begins to tremble. And so I ask you, what does a king do to the man who knows his secrets and holds his desire? Does he protect him, or destroy him so thoroughly that even history cannot speak his name without shame? The body twists in the wind, blood marking the earth like wax from a fallen candle. And in that stillness, we are left with a single terrible truth, that love in the court of kings is more dangerous than treason. Before the crowds turned and the gallows were built, there was only assent, radiant, unchallenged, almost divine. He was not born with bloodline nor battle scars, yet when he entered the court, it was as if the walls leaned in to listen. The king, cloaked in his loneliness and shackled by the gold of his own authority, saw in him something rare, a mirror not of duty, but of desire. Where others bowed, he smiled. Where others obeyed, he danced. And the king, starved for authenticity in a palace of masks, offered him something no law could grant, proximity to power. He became the sun around which royal favor orbited. The silk of his robes rivaled that of queens. His laughter echoed louder than war drums. Lords grit their teeth as he passed. But the king only watched him, watched with a softness that made bishops flinch. They rode together through the gardens, shared wine at twilight, shared glances that needed no words. The people called him a favorite. The court called him dangerous. The truth? He was a lover, a confidant, a parasite, a prince in all but name. It is said the king once halted council to ask him how his sleep had been. It is said a baron was banished for speaking his name with disdain. It is said they touched beneath the tapestries while priests turned away. Whether these are truths or courtly fables hardly matters now. What matters is how high he flew, untouched. By tradition, kissed by sovereignty, and crowned not with iron but with affection, and every rise, every room he entered without knocking, every noble displaced to make space for his smile, planted the seeds of the wrath to come, but in that moment he did not see it. Who among us does when the sun shines too brightly for shadows to take form? He believed, perhaps naively, that love could protect him, that the hand that caressed him would not one day sign his death. And so he rose, gilded by devotion and untouchable in the eyes of the one man who mattered most. But how high can you soar when your wings are stitched from scandal, and when your throne is built not on lineage, but on longing? It never begins with a blade. It begins with a glance, too long, too heavy. A silence in the council chamber, a wine cup left untouched. The king's favorite, once draped in triumph, began to notice doors that no longer opened, smiles that no longer reached the eyes. The courtiers, like wolves scenting blood, circled. The queen, humiliated yet calculating, watched from her cold perch, her heart hardening into something sharper than steel. The favorite had grown bold, too bold. He spoke when he should have bowed, interrupted war councils with poetry, mocked foreign ambassadors in jest, and most of all he stayed, long after the tryst should have faded, long after the king should have moved on. He lingered, not as a shadow, but as a flame, a living reminder that the king's heart beat not for duty, but for danger. It is said he dared to wear the king's jewels, that he entered the royal chapel alone, that he once sat in the throne laughing. But perhaps the greater sin was invisible, the sin of being loved openly, for in every corner of the palace, power is measured not in gold, but in proximity. And he, a man with no noble name, had trespassed too far. A letter was intercepted, intimate, unguarded, a wound laid bare in ink. It passed through too many hands, and each hand added venom. By the time it reached the queen, it was a confession. By the time it reached the bishops, it was heresy. The nobles, stripped of influence, found their rallying cry. A lover of the king. No. A corrupter, a seducer, a threat to God's order. Was this love, or a fatal mistake? Perhaps he thought the king would shield him again. That love, once promised, was a fortress. But he failed to see the one truth all courtiers learn too late. A king's love is never unconditional. It is bound by politics, by pride, by the eyes of history. And when that love begins to cost him power, he will burn it to preserve the throne. So the turning came not with screams, but with silence, with looks, with absences, until one day his name was no longer spoken in the throne room, only in the plotting shadows behind it. It came slowly, like dusk slipping into night, one candle extinguished at a time. The halls he once ruled with charm and laughter became corridors of suspicion. Every smile now hid a blade, every whisper behind velvet curtains carried the sound of his name, distorted, poisoned, cursed. The court that fickle beast began to feed. The queen moved like frost through the palace, cold and unseen, but everywhere. Her allies multiplied, noblemen once afraid, now emboldened by a shared disdain. And the clergy, silent for so long, emerged with scrolls, with scripture, with judgment. A favorite? No, they said. A corrupter. A man who defiled the divine order. God's punishment would begin with man's justice. And so the prayers turned to plans. Behind closed doors, forged letters were penned in trembling hands. They spoke of conspiracies, seductions, treason. Rumors became evidence. Love became crime. And the king, once protector, once flame, grew distant. Whether out of fear, pride, or guilt, he no longer defended. His silence was the first verdict. One night, the favorite's chamber doors did not open. His guards were gone. The candles burned low. And then the footsteps came. Not the king's, but the council's. They entered without ceremony, without mercy. He was dragged from his bed as if he were filth in a house too holy for his presence. His screams echoed down stone corridors lined with the paintings of saints. They paraded him through the court he once ruled, his clothes torn, his titles stripped. The same nobles who once bowed now spat. The same women who once blushed now turned away. A jester mocked him with a limp and painted bruises. Even the walls seemed to recoil, ashamed of what they had once allowed. Who is more dangerous, your enemy or your former lover? Betrayal is a strange beast. It does not bare its teeth at once. It waits, quiet, patient, smiling. And when it strikes, it does so with the faces you once trusted most, in the name of honor, in the name of God, in the name of country. His descent was not a fall, it was a dismantling. Piece by piece, favor by favor, until all that remained was the echo of what he once was. And in that echo, the court found its thrill. For nothing unites the powerful like the blood of one who rose too high and dared to love the king. There are deaths in history, quiet, dignified, fading like autumn leaves. This was not one of them. They did not allow him a cell. They gave him a stage, a scaffold erected not behind palace walls, but in the open square where butchered animals had once bled, where peasants tossed waste. The place reeked of slaughter and iron, and that was the point. His body, already broken from nights without sleep, meals denied, beatings masked as interrogation, was dragged into daylight. His hair, once perfumed, clung to his temples with sweat and blood. His eyes, once seductive, now stared into nothing. He didn't walk. He was carried. The sentence was not simply death, it was erasure. He would not die as a man, but as a lesson. They stripped him bare, not just of clothes, but of dignity, of privacy, of the humanity even criminals are afforded. The crowd was silent at first, unsure. But then came the murmurs, then the jeers, then the rocks, and then the knife. They castrated him before the execution, not with precision, but with cruelty. One noble, it is said, turned his face away. Another laughed. The surgeon, if one could call him that, did not clean the blade. There was no anesthesia, only rope to bind his arms and mouths to muffle his screams. The favorite shrieked once, then again, then no more. The stench of blood filled the square like incense in a blasphemous mass. Flies swarmed to the wet, open ruin of his body. A priest muttered a prayer. Someone vomited into the dust. The executioners hung him slowly, not by the neck, but by iron hooks driven through his thighs and back. Oh, spectacle! A punishment crafted to outlast breath. He kicked, he flailed, and then he simply twitched, a broken marionette with no strings left. When flesh is torn from pride, what remains? The king was not present, perhaps by design, perhaps by choice. But it said a messenger ran to him with news of the spectacle, and for a moment, just a moment, he wept. Or maybe he only blinked. And as the body sagged in the iron embrace, the people looked on, not in judgment, but in discomfort. They had not expected this, not such suffering, not such spectacle, not from a man who had once danced in marble halls. He bled not just from the body, but from history, his memory leaking into the ground, into the gutters, into the silence that always follows cruelty made public. And still, the hooks held. Still, the body hung. Because in courts built on fear, mercy is the first thing to die. By the time death came, it was not a mercy. It was a mockery. The sun had shifted behind clouds as if ashamed to watch. The square, once swollen with noise, had grown subdued, as though even the crowd felt the weight of what they had witnessed. Blood dripped rhythmically from the body above, staining the wood below in dark, pulsing blotches. The executioner, red to the elbows, leaned on his blade like a farmer after harvest, expressionless, used to this. But this was no ordinary crop. The favorite's eyes, swollen near shut, flickered. Whether he saw the crowd or the sky or nothing at all, none could say. His mouth opened one last time, not to speak but to gasp, a breath without words. The final instinct of a man who once whispered into a king's ear, now left speechless, in pain. It is said a dog wandered into the square and began to lap at the blood pooling beneath the scaffold. No one stopped it. The priest stepped forward and offered a final blessing, hesitant, uncertain, as if unsure whether the man above was truly damned or merely devoured. The bells did not toll. There were no trumpets, no official decree, just the creak of the wood and the hush of history folding in on itself. Was this justice or theatre? The crowd dispersed, slowly, reluctantly, as if they feared the memory might follow them home. Some turned their faces, others spat, a few cried. Not for the man, but for what had been allowed to unfold in public, in daylight, in their name. Later that night they cut the body down, not with reverence but with routine. The hooks were stained and rusting, the flesh stuck to iron. A few guards laughed, one retched, another whispered a prayer, but none looked him in the eye, not even in death. He had no final words, no last defiance, no poetic rebellion. His body had already said enough. It had spoken in blood and bruises, in silence and spasm, in the horror of being loved too visibly, too vulnerably. And so he died. Not as a traitor, not as a martyr, but as something worse, as a spectacle, a mirror shattered by those too afraid of what it reflected. They buried him quietly, far from the chapels of kings and the tombs of nobles. No name marked the stone. No prayers were sung in the royal court. His death was an event, his burial an inconvenience. He was laid in earth like refuse, as if Silence could erase the scream that still lingered in the minds of those who watched him die. In the days that followed, the court resumed its rhythm. Dinners were held, oaths were sworn, foreign ambassadors returned, but something in the palace had shifted. The king moved like a man shadowed by a ghost. He no longer laughed in the gardens. He no longer lingered in the chapel. The throne, once a place of ease, now looked more like a pyre. "Speak not his name," one guard whispered. "Not unless you want the same fate." The letters he once penned were burned. The portraits were taken down. The royal decree declared him a traitor, a seducer, a perversion. And yet, behind closed doors, servants spoke of the king waking in the night, drenched in sweat, of murmured apologies to no one, of a room kept locked, his favorite's chamber, untouched, preserved, a tomb in silk. The queen, triumphant in silence, wore pearls again. The bishops nodded at sermons, the nobles rejoiced in their regained influence, but beneath their victory lay the faint, rotting pulse of guilt, for they had not killed a man, they had unraveled a heart in public, then danced on its remains. What happens to stories the powerful want buried? Time, it seems, is a cruel accomplice. It does not erase, it disguises. Decades later, when asked about the man who once stood at the king's side, a court chronicler simply said, "He overstepped. He was corrected." But those who saw, truly saw, knew the truth. You could remove his titles, burn his letters, even desecrate his corpse, but you could not unmake the love that once ignited a throne. And so he lingered, not in memory, but in omission, a silence too sharp to ignore, a shadow too long to step around. History forgets nothing. It merely changes the names, the faces, the methods. Centuries pass, and still in every glittering court there is a favorite, a face too close to power, a soul too radiant for shadows, and always eventually a reckoning. They never carved his story into stone. No stained glass bears his likeness, and yet he haunts the margins of royal chronicles, unspoken, unwritten, but never absent. A ghost in velvet, a warning dressed in silk. He reminds us that proximity to a crown does not sanctify, it endangers, because kings may love, but they love through mirrors, and when the reflection begins to speak, to breathe, to dream, it must be shattered. What does this tale reveal? Not just about monarchy, but about us. That power is a jealous God, that the closer we get to love in places ruled by fear, the more swiftly that love is devoured. That beauty, when it threatens, order must be broken, not because it is wrong, but because it is too right, too undeniable, too real. He was not the first to die for being adored too openly, nor the last. Antinous drowned in the Nile, Villiers stabbed in a tavern, each one beloved, each one destroyed, and each time the world learned the same cruel lesson, that kings may flirt with affection, but they marry control. In secret, some say the king aged rapidly after his death, that his hands trembled at dawn, that he refused to speak of the boy, that when he died he asked for a ring he had once given him, long lost, long forgotten, buried in the mud where no one would dare retrieve it. Today we remember monarchs for their wars, their wealth, their heirs, but the true measure of power lies not in how it rules, but in what it fears. And nothing, it seems, terrifies power more than the softness it cannot control. He was the king's moon, brighter in reflection than the sun itself. And so they pulled him from the sky, not because he betrayed the throne, but because he illuminated it too well, because he dared to exist not as an ornament, but as a soul. And in the end, the greatest crime in royal courts is not treason, it is intimacy, and for that he was castrated, hung, erased, but not forgotten.